Here is a question worth sitting with. If God exists as the ultimate creator of all things, can he truly be held to a moral standard defined by human beings? That tension sits at the heart of one of the most common objections to the Christian faith. Critics point to the Old Testament and see violence, conquest, and commands that feel deeply uncomfortable by modern standards. They conclude that the God of the Bible cannot be good. But Christians make a staggering counterclaim. They argue that God is not simply a being who follows morality, he is the very source of it. So we are left with a genuine collision. Either God is subject to a moral law above himself, or he is the foundation from which all moral law flows. How we answer that question changes everything about how we read Scripture, how we understand justice, and ultimately, how we understand the nature of God himself. Here is where the conversation gets philosophically interesting. When someone looks at the Old Testament and says God is immoral, they are making a moral judgment. They are holding God up against a standard and declaring he falls short. But pause right there and ask a simple question. Where did that standard come from? Think about it carefully. If the universe is purely material, if human beings are simply the product of blind evolutionary processes, then morality is nothing more than a survival preference. It carries no real authority. You cannot use a ruler made of rubber to declare something crooked. Every critic who calls God unjust is unknowingly borrowing a framework of justice to make that accusation. But borrowed from where? Borrowed from whom? This is the core problem. Morality requires a moral lawgiver. A law without a lawgiver is just noise, and that lawgiver, as we will see, points directly back to God himself. So where does morality actually come from? The Bible gives us a direct answer in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, which states that God created humanity in his own image. This single verse carries enormous moral weight. If human beings are made in the image of God, then our capacity to recognize right from wrong is not a random evolutionary accident. It is a reflection of divine character embedded within us at the moment of creation. Think about that for a moment. Every time you feel genuine outrage at injustice, every time your conscience tells you something is deeply wrong, you are experiencing a moral intuition that traces back to God himself. Our ability to even have this conversation about ethics, to evaluate actions as good or evil, is itself evidence that a moral standard exists beyond us, and that standard has a source. So before we examine specific difficult passages, we need to understand who God actually claims to be, because you cannot fairly judge someone's actions without first understanding their character. In Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7, God reveals himself in one of the most remarkable self-descriptions in all of Scripture. He declares himself compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. This is not the portrait of a cosmic tyrant looking for reasons to destroy people. This is a God whose very nature is defined by patience and mercy. This matters enormously because every action God takes in Scripture must be interpreted through this revealed character as the baseline. Isolated incidents pulled from context will always distort the picture. The lens through which we read everything else must be this foundational self-revelation of who God is. Now let's tackle one of the most cited objections head-on, the Canaanite conquest found in Deuteronomy chapter 7 and Joshua chapter 6. Critics often label these passages as divine genocide, but that conclusion ignores critical historical and theological context. The Canaanites were not simply a rival ethnic group. Ancient historical records and archaeological evidence confirm they practiced ritualistic child sacrifice, temple prostitution, and extreme moral corruption spanning hundreds of years. God did not act impulsively. He acted after extraordinary patience. The judgment that finally came was not the reaction of an angry deity looking for a reason to destroy. It was the measured response of a holy God who had watched generations of innocent children burned alive on altars. Understanding who the Canaanites actually were completely reframes what these passages are communicating about divine justice. What makes this even more compelling is that God did not simply tolerate the Canaanites briefly before striking. He waited generations. In Genesis chapter 15, verse 16, God speaks directly to Abraham and tells him that his descendants cannot yet return to the land because the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. Let that sink in. God is essentially saying, the judgment is coming, but not yet, because the corruption has not fully run its course. This is not the behavior of a trigger-happy deity looking for an excuse to destroy. This is a God who delays judgment for centuries, giving even deeply wicked societies time to turn around. The Amorites had generations to change course. God's patience is not passive indifference. It is active, deliberate, and costly restraint, revealing a character far more merciful than his critics are willing to acknowledge. Now let's tackle one of the most emotionally charged objections: slavery in the Old Testament. Critics often read Exodus 21 and immediately picture the brutal chattel slavery of the antebellum American South, where human beings were bought, sold, and stripped of all dignity based purely on race. But that comparison fundamentally misrepresents what the biblical text actually describes. What Exodus 21 regulates is debt-based servitude, a system where people who could not repay debts entered temporary household service. And here is what makes this remarkable for the ancient world. Biblical law included genuine protections. Servants had legal rights. Masters faced harsh penalties for physical abuse. And every 7th year, servants were to be released. Completely free. No surrounding ancient culture offered anything remotely close to these protections. Rather than endorsing exploitation, biblical law was actually placing radical limits on it, elevating human dignity in ways that were genuinely revolutionary for that era. This brings us to one of the most important concepts for understanding the Bible's moral development: progressive revelation. God did not hand humanity the complete moral framework of Scripture all at once. Instead, he worked patiently within human cultural contexts, gradually elevating moral standards over time as humanity could receive them. Think of it like a teacher who meets students at their current level before introducing more advanced material. Jesus himself acknowledged this principle directly in Matthew chapter 19, verse 8, when he explained that Moses permitted divorce because of the hardness of human hearts. Notice what Jesus is saying here. God accommodated human moral limitations at a particular stage in history, not because compromise was the final goal, but because transformation is a process. This reveals a God who is not indifferent to human weakness, but strategically works through it, always moving his people toward a higher standard of love and justice. Building on this idea of progressive revelation, we arrive at the moment where everything comes into focus. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, Jesus makes a stunning declaration. He says he came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. That single statement reframes the entire Old Testament. Those ancient laws were never meant to be the final word. They were pointing forward, preparing humanity for something greater. Think of it like a tutor guiding students toward graduation. The Apostle Paul captures this perfectly in Galatians chapter 3, verse 24, describing the law as a guardian leading us to Christ. The moral trajectory running through every page of Scripture moves consistently toward love, justice, and redemption. The difficult passages of the Old Testament are not contradictions of God's character. They are chapters in a larger story that finds its ultimate meaning and resolution in Jesus Christ. Now here is something remarkable that often gets overlooked in this entire conversation. The Apostle Paul, writing to the Romans in chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, makes a stunning observation. He says that even Gentiles, people who never received the law of Moses, never read the Torah, never sat in a synagogue, still demonstrate the work of that same law written on their hearts. Their conscience bears witness, accusing or defending their own actions. Think about what that actually means. Across every culture, every civilization, every era of human history, people instinctively recognize that murder is wrong, that betrayal is shameful, that protecting the innocent matters. Nobody had to teach humanity these foundations from scratch. Paul is arguing that this universal moral intuition is not coincidence, it is evidence. It points directly back to a God who embedded his moral character into the very fabric of human consciousness, making him the objective and universal source of morality itself. Some critics argue that a truly good God would never command death under any circumstances. But this objection overlooks something foundational. God is not simply a powerful being operating within the universe. He is the author of life itself. Deuteronomy 32:39 records God declaring, "I put to death and I bring to life." This is not a confession of cruelty. It is a statement of sovereignty. God does not take life as an act of violence the way humans do. He is the one who granted life in the first place. Think of it this way. A novelist has authority over characters that no reader possesses. Similarly, God's relationship to human life is categorically different from any human judge or critic. When God ordains death, he operates from a position no human standard can fairly evaluate, because no human being is the source of life itself. Now we arrive at the most powerful answer to every moral accusation leveled against God: the cross. Romans 5:8 states plainly that God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Think carefully about what that means. This is not the action of a distant, indifferent deity dispensing judgment from a safe distance. This is God entering human suffering, absorbing the full weight of condemnation, and dying in the place of the guilty. No genuinely immoral being sacrifices himself for those who deserve punishment. The crucifixion stands as the single greatest moral act in all of human history. It does not reveal a God who enjoys destruction. It reveals a God who would rather die than abandon the people he loves. The cross does not contradict God's goodness. It defines it completely. Now let's be honest about something important. Some of these passages are genuinely hard to read. Feeling the weight of them is not weakness, and wrestling with them is not faithlessness. That tension deserves to be acknowledged, not dismissed. What is remarkable is that the Bible itself makes room for exactly this kind of struggle. Consider Job, a man who sat in devastating suffering and directly questioned whether God was being just. He did not whisper his doubts quietly. He cried them out loud. And at the end of the story, God did not condemn Job for his honesty. In fact, God rebuked the friends who offered tidy theological answers instead of genuine wrestling. This tells us something profound. Honest inquiry does not threaten God. The struggle itself is biblical. God is not fragile, and your questions are not too dangerous for him to handle. Bring them forward. So let's return to where we started. Can God be judged by a moral standard that humans define? Here's the stunning conclusion. Without God as the foundation of morality, there is no standard at all. Morality becomes nothing more than personal preference or cultural opinion. And if that's true, then the entire criticism against God collapses under its own weight. You cannot call God unjust if justice itself has no objective grounding. This is precisely what Clive Staples Lewis discovered. Before his conversion, Lewis used the existence of injustice as an argument against God. But then he realized something that stopped him cold. His argument required a real, objective standard of justice to even function. And that standard only made coherent sense if God existed. The very objection he raised against God became evidence for God. The argument defeated itself, and Lewis eventually surrendered to the one he had been arguing against. Here is the invitation. The very discomfort you feel when reading difficult biblical passages is itself a moral reaction. You sense something should be right or wrong. That instinct did not come from nowhere. It points to a lawgiver. You cannot borrow a moral standard to condemn God and then pretend that standard appeared from nothing. The reaction itself is evidence, and if that evidence leads you somewhere uncomfortable, follow it honestly. Because the God revealed across Scripture is not a distant tyrant hurling judgment from the shadows. He is a God who entered human history, absorbed the weight of justice himself, and still calls humanity to something higher. As Micah chapter 6 verse 8 reminds us, what does the Lord require of you but to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God? That is not the demand of a monster. That is the eternal standard of everything good.